The wagon train pulled away from Susanna Kirk in a slow, rolling cloud of dust, and she was too weak to do anything but watch it go, her daughter's small hand gripping hers so hard it hurt. "Mama," Bertie whispered, 8 years old and trying very hard not to cry in front of her little sister. "They're not stopping." "I know, baby," Susanna said, though the words came out cracked and faint, her whole body burning with a fever that had climbed steadily for 3 days until the desert heat and the sickness inside her had become one indistinguishable furnace. She had heard Garrett Voss's voice from very far away that morning, arguing with two of the other families, saying a wagon train that stopped to nurse every fever case through the flats would be caught by the first mountain snow with everyone dead, instead of just one woman, and that the kindest thing, the only sensible thing, was to leave the widow Kirk and her girls at the old relay station with what water and rations could be spared, and let God or good luck decide the rest. Nobody had voted against him loudly enough to matter. A few of the women had cried. Old Mrs. Fenner had pressed a jar of preserves into Bertie's hands and would not meet Susanna's eyes doing it, and had lingered a moment longer than the others, murmuring something Susanna was too fevered to catch, before Voss's sharp voice called her back to her own wagon. Two of the men had argued for leaving one water cask more than Voss allotted, and lost that argument same as they'd lost the larger one, and the whole slow creaking train had rolled on west into the heat shimmer at last, wheels groaning, children's voices fading, until even the dust of it thinned to nothing against the white sky. Susanna Kirk lay in the shade of a collapsed relay station roof, with 5-year-old Nell crying softly against her shoulder and 8-year-old Bertie standing guard over both of them with a stick she'd found. As if a stick could do anything at all against the desert, or the fever, or the terrible knowledge settling over all three of them, that the world had simply decided to go on without them. The relay station had been abandoned itself for years, its adobe walls crumbled to knee-height on two sides, its roof holding up only a single corner's worth of shade, and Susanna understood with the small, clear part of her mind. The fever had not yet claimed that this was no shelter at all, only the memory of one, and that memory would not keep her daughters alive once the cask ran dry. She thought of Warren then, her husband 2 years in his grave from the same kind of slow, wasting sickness, and of the letter from his brother in California that had finally arrived last spring, offering land and welcome to a widow with 2 girls and no other family left to lean on in Missouri. She had sold nearly everything she owned to buy passage on Voss's train, telling herself the whole long way west that she was giving Bertie and Nell a future instead of the slow, grinding poverty of a rented room in a town that had already begun to look at a widow and her fatherless daughters as a burden to be managed rather than a family to be helped. She had thought herself brave, setting out. She thought now that perhaps this was only fitting, a widow dying in the dust the same as her husband had died in his bed, except that Warren had died with her hand in his, and she was going to die with nothing to give her own daughters but a stick and a jar of preserves, and the terrible arithmetic of how many swallows of water remained in the cask. She did not remember losing consciousness. She remembered only, dimly, Bertie's voice rising high and desperate into the shimmering emptiness of the flats, shouting at something Susanna could not see, and then nothing at all. Nalin Aki had ridden out to the old relay station, because his water tank on that stretch of range had sprung a leak 2 days running, and he meant to see whether the trouble was in the pipe or the float valve before he lost another day's grazing to it. He was not a man who welcomed surprises on his own range, not since the year 8 winters back, when surprise had come to his door in the shape of a doctor's grim face, and taken his wife Eliza and their infant son inside the same terrible week. And he had built his life, Since then, around a careful, guarded solitude that asked nothing of the world and hoped to be asked nothing back. So when he came over the last rise and saw a child waving a stick over her head and screaming for help at the sight of his dust, his first thought was that trouble had found him anyway, the way it generally did, whether a man built walls against it or not. The girl 8, maybe 9, filthy and sunburned and shaking, did not wait for him to dismount before she was pulling at his stirrup leather, words tumbling out of her too fast to follow. "Please, mister, it's my mama. She's awful sick and they left us. The wagons left us here 2 days back and we're near out of water, and I don't know what to do, please." Nalin swung down and followed her at a run to the shade of the collapsed roof, where a woman lay motionless on a bedroll gone dark with sweat, her face gray-pale beneath a fever flush, breathing too fast and too shallow, while a smaller girl of perhaps 5 knelt beside her sobbing, without making much sound anymore, as though she had cried herself past the point where sound helped. He knelt and pressed the back of his hand to the woman's forehead, and felt heat come off her skin like a stove left banked too long, and understood in that single touch that she was closer to dying than any living person he'd knelt beside since Eliza, and that whatever careful solitude he had built for himself over 8 years was about to be asked, all at once, for everything it had left in it. He remembered, kneeling there in the white desert light, the particular helplessness of that other sick room 8 years gone, Eliza's hand gone slack in his own, sometime past midnight, the doctor arriving a full day too late from the county seat, his infant son never having drawn breath long enough to be given the name they'd argued over so happily all that last summer. He had told himself for 8 years that he had done everything a man could do, and some nights he even believed it. Kneeling now over a stranger burning with the same fever, he felt the old grief rear up fresh and raw, and made himself a promise on the spot that whatever this woman cost him, in worry or in grief, or in the reopening of wounds he'd spent 8 years trying to keep closed, he would not ride away from this one the way death had ridden away from him with everything that mattered. "What's your mama's name?" he said to the older girl, keeping his voice steady for her sake. "Susanna Kirk, I'm Bertie, that's Nell." Bertie's chin trembled, fighting to hold itself steady. "Is she going to die, mister?" "Not if I've got any say in it," Nalin said, and meant it with a fierceness that surprised him, coming from a man who had spent 8 years trying very hard not to want anything badly enough to be gutted by losing it. He got Susanna up onto his own saddle in front of him, wrapped in the bedroll against the jolting ride, and set both girls up behind the cantle, with instructions to hold tight and holler if their mother's breathing changed, and rode the 6 miles to his ranch house harder than he'd ridden anything since the day Eliza took sick, praying the whole way to a God he had mostly stopped speaking to, that he would not arrive home, only to bury a stranger in the same ground where his wife and son already lay. The fever did not break easily, nor soon. Nalin sent his hired man, a quiet, capable Mexican vaquero named Tomás, riding hard for the doctor in Mesquite Bend, and Tomás came back after nightfall alone, saying Doc available was 3 days out on a difficult berthing at the Prather place and could not be reached sooner. That left Nalin and 2 frightened girls, and whatever Nalin's own hard-won memory of nursing, a fevered wife could teach him, which was not enough, and which he was terrified would not be enough again. He worked through that first night, and the next with cold cloths and willow bark tea boiled strong, with broth forced by careful spoonfuls between Susanna's cracked lips, with Bertie holding the lamp steady with a child's fierce concentration, and little Nell curled asleep at last against his own shoulder, because she would not settle anywhere else. Tomás rode a wide circle each day checking the doctor's whereabouts, and came back each evening shaking his head. And between rides, he kept the girls fed and occupied as best he could, carving Nell a small wooden horse from a scrap of mesquite root to keep her hands busy while her mother's fever raged, and teaching Bertie, in his careful, accented English, the names of the stars that came out hard and bright over the desert once the sun went down. Because a frightened child needed something to look at besides her mother's gray face. Nalin talked to Susanna through the worst of it, low and constant, though she gave no sign of hearing him, telling her about the ranch, about the leaking water tank that had brought him to her in the first place, about the horses he was gentling, and the fence line that needed mending come spring, about anything at all that might give a drowning mind something to hold onto and swim toward. On the second night, when her breathing turned shallow and fast enough to frighten even Tamaz's steady calm, Bertie crept to the bedside and took her mother's other hand in both of her small ones and began, unprompted, to recite the same bedtime rhyme Susanna had murmured over her, and Nell every night of their lives, her child's voice cracking but not stopping, as though she believed the familiar words might reach her mother where nothing else could. Nalin, watching an 8-year-old girl fight for her mother's life with nothing but a nursery rhyme and sheer stubborn love, found his own throat too tight to trust with speech for a long while after. "You don't have to die here," he told her, somewhere in the black hollow of the second night, her hand gripped tight in both of his own rough ones. "Your girls need you a sight more than this desert needs one more grave. Fight it, Susanna Kirk. Fight it for them if you've got nothing left to fight it for yourself." Whether it was the willow bark, or the broth, or simple stubbornness, or something in the low steady sound of a stranger's voice, refusing to let her go, Susanna's fever broke an hour before dawn on the third night, her skin turning cool and damp under Nalin's hand, where it had burned like a stovetop for 2 full days, and she opened her eyes for the first time since the wagon train's dust had swallowed her, and found a weathered, unfamiliar face bent close over hers in lamplight, and 2 small shapes asleep in a nearby chair that her fever-scrambled heart recognized before her fever-scrambled mind caught up to the fact. "My girls," she rasped. "Safe," Nalin said. "Both of them. Safe and fed and asleep right there, ma'am, and have been every hour since I found the 3 of you." He said it plain, without any drama in it, the way a man reports a simple fact, and Susanna, staring up at him through the last fog of the fever, understood that this stranger had likely saved all their lives at some real cost to whatever quiet he'd been keeping for himself, and did not yet have the strength to do anything but weep, silent and grateful, until she slept again. She woke each morning after that a little stronger, and to the smell of coffee and bacon, and to Bertie's face pressed close to hers, and to the plain, careful account pieced together over the following days from Bertie's telling and Nalin's few added words of a lone rancher who had ridden out for a leaking water tank and ridden home instead with a dying stranger and her children, and had not once, in 3 days and nights of fever and fear, suggested that he regretted it. She tried, once she was strong enough to stand without the room tilting, to insist on earning her keep rather than accept charity she had no way to repay. Nalin found her attempting to scrub his kitchen floor on her knees, not 4 days past the worst of the fever, and lifted her bodily back to the chair by the stove with a look that told her arguing would waste breath she didn't yet have to spare. Doc Available finally rode in from the Prather place that same week, weary from a long birthing of his own, and examined Susanna with a thoroughness that made her feel, for the first time since the fever took her, like a person being cared for rather than merely fought over between life and death. "Whoever nursed you through the worst of that fever without me knew what he was about," the doctor said, packing his bag back up. "I've seen grown men with medical training make a worse job of a trail fever than what's been done here. You'll want quiet and broth and no heavy work for a fortnight yet, Mrs. Kirk, but I'd say you've come through the hard part whole." He glanced toward the kitchen, where Nalin stood pretending not to listen, while he split kindling far more vigorously than the task required, and added, with the dry amusement of a man who had delivered enough babies and buried enough patience to read a room accurately, that it seemed the whole household had rather a large stake in her recovery, not merely the invalid herself. "You'll earn your keep plenty once you've got the strength for it," he said. "Mending, cooking, whatever suits you. I'm not a rich man, and I won't pretend 3 extra mouths cost me nothing. But I didn't ride 6 miles with a fevered stranger across my saddle to turn around and work her into a relapse inside a week." "Why did you?" Susanna asked, the question that had been sitting in her chest since the fever broke. "Ride out for us at all, I mean. You didn't know us." Nalin was quiet a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "8 years back I lost my wife and my boy both to a fever not so different from yours, in about the same span of days it took yours to break. I couldn't save them. I've had 8 years to sit with that particular failure, and not much to show for the sitting except a leaking water tank and a house too quiet by half. When I found your girl waving that stick over her head, I expect some part of me decided I wasn't going to fail the same way twice, whatever it cost me. That's the plain truth of it, ma'am. I won't dress it up prettier than it was." It was not a declaration of anything beyond honesty, and Susanna did not mistake it for more than that in the weeks that followed, weeks in which she regained her strength slowly, helping where she could, watching her daughters grow brown and easy and unafraid again under the wide Mesquite Bend sky, watching too the quiet, careful way Nalin Ackerman had of being kind without once making a show of it, mending Bertie's broken toy wagon without being asked, teaching Nell to whistle through a blade of grass. Never once treating either girl as an inconvenience, he was tolerating for their mother's sake. She caught herself, some evenings, watching him across the supper table with a feeling she was slow to name, because naming it felt disloyal to Warren's memory, and because a widow twice orphaned of a husband's love had no business hoping for a second helping of something so many women never got even once. She told herself what she felt was gratitude, plain and simple, the natural warmth any decent person would feel toward a man who had ridden into the desert and carried her home across his own saddle. She told herself that through the whole slow business of the harvest, watching him teach Bertie to sit a horse properly, watching him carry Nell on his shoulders back from the creek so her bare feet wouldn't blister on the hot ground, watching the particular gentleness he saved only for the 3 of them and no one else in the whole county. She was still telling herself that the evening she found herself standing at the kitchen window, watching him mend a hinge on the barn door in the last long light, and felt something in her chest go warm and unsteady in a way gratitude alone had never managed, and understood, with a small private shock, that she had stopped grieving Warren somewhere in the last 2 months without ever quite noticing the moment it happened, and had started, instead, to hope. Bertie noticed before either of the adults said a word of it aloud. "You like him," she informed her mother one evening, with the blunt certainty only a child possesses, while they shelled peas together on the porch steps. "You watch him the way you used to watch Papa come in from the fields." "Bertie Kirk," Susanna said, flushing, "that is not a suitable thing to say to your mother." "It's true, though," Bertie said, unbothered, and went back to her peas. And Susanna found she could not honestly argue the point, only sit with the warm, frightening truth of it a while longer in the gathering dusk. The town, when word of it reached Mesquite Bend, did not take so generous a view. A widow and 2 young ones keeping house under a bachelor's roof for going on 2 months, Mrs. Prout from the Mercantile said to anyone in earshot, loud enough that Susanna, in town for flour and thread, could not help but hear it. Whatever the circumstances of how it started, is not a situation any respectable woman ought to let continue past the point of decency. A few of the other women in the store murmured agreement, and one, a Mrs. Otley whom Susanna had never so much as met, added that she supposed some women knew how to make the most of a stranger's charity when it suited them. And Susanna stood at the counter with her flour and thread, and felt the whole room's judgment settle over her like a second fever, hot and shaming, though she had done nothing in that house but recover from near death and mend the shirts of a man who had asked for nothing in return. She said little in her own defense, because she had learned since Warren's death that defending herself to a room already decided against her rarely changed a single mind, and only cost her more dignity in the trying. She paid for her purchases with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and walked out into the sun-white street with her chin held as level as she could manage, and rode back to the ranch that evening turning over, with a heavy heart, whether the kindest thing she could do for Nalin Ackerman's reputation was to take her girls and find some other arrangement. A position as a housekeeper, somewhere respectable, perhaps, or a letter finally sent to Warren's brother in California. However much the thought of leaving that quiet house and its quiet, steady man cost her to consider, she said nothing of her decision to Nalin that night, turning it over alone long after the girls were asleep, and only Bertie's sharp eyes, watching her mother pack a small bundle of mending the next morning with a face gone carefully blank, guessed that something had shifted. She might have done it, too, within the week, had Garrett Voss not chosen that same span of days to ride back through Mesquite Bend on his return trip east, and hear, over a saloon whiskey, that the widow he'd left for dead on the desert flats was not only alive, but keeping house on a local rancher's spread. He rode out to Nalin's ranch 2 days later with 2 hired men flanking him, wearing the particular satisfied look of a man who believes he has found an unexpected debt to collect. "Mrs. Kirk," he said, not troubling to dismount, "you'll recall the Wagon Company's terms of passage included provisions and water furnished on credit against your husband's estate, which by my reckoning still stands unpaid at some $40, seeing as you never completed the journey to discharge it in labor as agreed. I'm prepared to be reasonable about collection. Your girls are old enough to work off the balance in service to my company come next season's train, and we'll call the debt settled square." Susanna went cold all through, understanding at once what he was proposing wrapped up in the polite language of commerce. Her daughters bound into a Wagon Company's service to satisfy a debt that had been incurred in her clear memory, entirely on credit terms Voss himself had dictated and never once written down. "There is no such agreement," she said, finding her voice though it shook. "You left us to die in that desert, Mr. Voss. You'll not now claim my children as payment for the privilege of surviving it." Susanna felt Nell's small fingers dig into the back of her skirt and Bertie step half in front of her sister. Chin jutted out in an unconscious echo of the stick-wielding courage that had first drawn Nalin to them across the flats, and something in the sight of her daughters bracing themselves against a threat they should never have had to face steadied Susanna's own fear into something closer to fury. "Get off my land," Nalin said, stepping between Voss's horse and the porch where Susanna stood with both girls drawn close behind her skirts, his voice gone very quiet and very hard, the voice of a man who had already decided exactly how far he was prepared to go, and was waiting only to see if he'd be made to prove it. "There's no debt here but the one you owe this family for leaving them to die, and I'll be riding to the circuit judge myself to see it recorded that way, unless you're gone from this porch inside the minute." One of the hired men shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his belt in a slow, deliberate warning, and Tamaz, who had come around the corner of the barn at the first sound of strange horses, stepped into the yard with a shotgun cradled loose, but ready in the crook of his arm, saying nothing at all, which somehow made the message plainer than any words could have. Voss's eyes flicked from Nalin to Tamaz, to the two frightened girls on the porch, doing the arithmetic of the odds, and did not care for the sum. Voss's smile thinned. "I don't believe you understand the position you're taking, Mr. Ackerman. My company has friends in this county who will back my claim over the word of a woman with no husband and no paper to her name." "Then it's a fortunate thing," Nalin said, "that I kept the letter you had Mrs. Fenner write out and sign before your whole train, describing exactly how and why you abandoned 3 people in the flats to die, on account of Mrs. Fenner's conscience troubling her enough on the journey west that she thought to send it back with the next rider east, addressed to me, in case Susanna Kirk ever needed proof of what was done to her. It arrived a week past. I expect the circuit judge will find it considerably more persuasive than any verbal debt you're inventing on my porch tonight." The satisfaction drained slowly out of Voss's face as the 2 hired men flanking him exchanged an uneasy glance. Neither of them, it was plain, having signed on to be named in a sworn account of leaving women and children to perish in the desert. Voss opened his mouth to bluster further, caught the look on Nalin's face, the look of a man who had already buried a wife and son, and was not, tonight, in any mood to be argued out of protecting what remained standing on his porch, and thought better of it. He wheeled his horse without another word, and rode off into the dusk with his 2 men trailing uncertainly behind him, and did not, in the weeks that followed, trouble Mesquite Bend or the Ackerman Ranch again. Word came later that the circuit judge, presented with Mrs. Fenner's letter, had stripped Voss of his wagon company's license entire and sent him east to answer for it. Susanna stood on the porch a long while after the dust of their leaving had settled, shaking now that the danger had passed, and found Nalin's arm coming around her shoulders steady and sure, the way it had not quite dared to before that night. "You kept that letter a week," she said, "and never told me." "Didn't want to frighten you with a threat that might never come," Nalin said. "Only wanted to be ready if it did. Same as I mean to be ready for whatever comes next, Susanna, if you'll let me." He turned her gently to face him, Bertie and Nell both watching with wide, unguarded hope from the doorway behind them. "I built walls around this place 8 years back because I couldn't bear the notion of loving anything hard enough to lose it again. I didn't reckon on a girl waving a stick at me on the flats, or on how quick a house fills up and starts feeling like a house again once there's noise in it, and small feet on the stairs, and a woman who argues with me about scrubbing floors she's got no business scrubbing. I love you. I expect I have for weeks now, and only just found the nerve to say it plain. I'd like you to stay, not as a woman working off a stranger's kindness, but as my wife, if you'll have a man who let his heart go quiet too long and is only just remembering how to use it." Susanna, who had buried a husband and nearly her own life, and had ridden into this valley believing herself abandoned by the whole world, found she had no words ready-made for an answer that large, and so she gave him instead the truest one she had. She stepped into the circle of his arms in front of her daughters and the wide Mesquite Bend sky, and said only, "Yes," and felt, for the first time since Warren's funeral, that the word cost her nothing at all to give. Word of Voss's license being stripped by the circuit judge reached Mesquite Bend within the month, carried home by a freighter who'd heard it discussed at the county seat, and Mrs. Prout, to her credit, was among the first to hear the fuller account of what had actually happened on the desert flats, and to feel, visibly, ashamed of how quickly she judged a dying woman's arrival in a bachelor's house, without ever once asking what circumstance had brought her there. She came out to the ranch herself not long after, bearing a jar of her own preserves by way of apology, and stayed long enough to admit to Susanna, stiffly, but sincerely, that she had let her tongue run ahead of her Christian charity, and hoped there were no hard feelings carried forward into whatever the future held. They were married that autumn in the little Mesquite Bend chapel, with Tamaz standing up as witness and half the town turning out despite Mrs. Pruitt's earlier objections, since even she could not argue, in the end, with a man who had ridden a fevered stranger home across his own saddle, and then faced down a wagon master to keep her children safe. Bertie and Nell wore new dresses Susanna had sewn from cloth Nalin brought back from the mercantile without being asked, and stood at the front of the little church solemn and shining, each of them clutching a small bundle of desert wildflowers Tamaz had helped them gather that morning. And when the preacher asked if Nalin Ackerman took this woman to be his wife, he answered so certain and so glad that even Mrs. Pruitt, dabbing her eyes in the third pew, allowed afterward that she supposed some hard men only needed the right family to soften them proper. Doc Available stood near the back with his own wife, remarking to anyone who'd listened that he'd delivered a good many happy endings in his years riding this county, but few he'd enjoyed watching unfold quite so much as this one, seeing as he'd had no hand in the saving of it at all, and had arrived only in time to confirm what love and stubbornness had already accomplished without him. Susanna stood on the ranch house porch that first night as a wife again, Nell asleep against her shoulder and Bertie's laughter carrying from somewhere near the barn, where Tamaz was teaching her to whistle louder than her sister ever had, and felt Nalin's hand settle warm over hers on the porch rail, the same steady hand that had pressed cool cloths to her fever and stood between his family and a man come to steal them away. "Any regrets, Mrs. Ackerman?" he asked, low, watching her face in the lamplight spilling from the window behind them. "Only that it took a wagon train's cruelty to bring me here," Susanna said. "I might have gone my whole life never knowing a man could be this steady, this kind, without ever once making a show of either." She turned into the circle of his arm, Nell's small weight warm and trusting against her shoulder, and looked out over the dark ranch yard where her daughters had learned to laugh again under a stranger's roof that had become, in the space of one long, terrible fever and one long, tender autumn, simply and irrevocably home. She thought of the desert flats where the world had once rolled away from her in a cloud of dust and left her for dead, of the stick Bertie had waved uselessly at the whole indifferent horizon, of the jar of preserves that had been the only kindness the wagon train left behind, and marveled at the strange, unlikely road that had carried her, instead of into a grave, straight into the one home built sturdy enough to hold all three of them for good, and one man steady enough to have carried them there.